We talked about tips for improving your fire in part one. For part two, I really want to focus on using reference images to help you improve. I get a lot of questions when it comes to using reference images and creating fire or rendering fire with an airbrush. It normally comes about when I show either a student or somebody that just wants to view my work something that I've actually painted, and then I show them the reference image or images that I use to create that fire. Generally, my painting doesn't look a lot like the actual reference image that was used. That spurs the question, well, how do you use that reference image to come up with that layout and that design? So that's what I want to focus on for part two. I have a reference image up here. I'm going to put it up on the screen so that you can take a screenshot if you'd like to follow along and practice what I'm showing you as well. The downside to using a reference image when you're doing fire, when you're painting fire, is in my eyes there's not a lot in this particular image that I'm going to use. There are some very specific elements that I really like that I want to incorporate, but there's a lot of stuff that is not going to wind up being used in the end. And that's why I recommend using multiple references, especially if I'm working on something large. I can take elements from 2, 3, 4, 5 different reference images and then put them all together. To keep this simple, we're just going to focus on using this image for this video. So the first thing I want to do is look at the actual image and start to pick out things that I really like. The first thing you have to keep in mind is what we discussed in part one. We are not trying to create a photorealistic painting of fire. This is very stylized. It's an artist interpretation of what fire might look like. And that's why a lot of what you see in this image is not really usable in my eyes. I'm looking for those specific little portions of this image that will translate well in a stylized painting versus trying to make it look real. So I'm looking for shapes that correspond to the freehand shields or templates that we use to create a realistic fire painting. The first one that really jumps out to me is this shape right up in here. So it starts right here. You see this little curve and that yellow orangey hot spot. It comes up, kind of fades out. There's 2 different layers here, but you can follow this shape up and around all the way up to the top where it's got this nice little barb, and then it comes back around and around again. This kind of fades off into nothing, but then you have another nice little curve here. Again, it fades off into nothing, and then there's a nice curve here. Those are the types of shapes that I'm looking for in a reference image to incorporate into my artwork. A lot of times you'll see shapes in a reference image that are a lot like a traditional set of flames. There's one right here. If you follow this, and then you see this little shape right here is very recognizable as a traditional flame lick. You could incorporate that. Here's another one that's much like a traditional flame lick. Now the top of this doesn't come to a point on either of these, but it's still very traditional-like in the sense that you have this nice rounded shape there, and then it comes back down, thins out down here. So those are the shapes that I'm looking for. I really like this shape right here. Again, you have this nice curved section that looks very similar to the shapes that we use on our freehand shields to create this effect. And then you've got another little sharp point right there. Kind of fades out. There's a little bit of a curve there, but it fades. And then you've got a nice line here. And again, there's 2 layers here. So you have to be able to look at this and kind of separate the layers when you're picking out the elements that you like or are appealing to you. So these, what I've pointed out so far, are very easy to incorporate into an airbrush painting of fire. All of these shapes that I've pointed out so far would work really well for the middle or even the end of your story. Here's another shape that I really like. How this one kind of curves around to the right. It's got a hot spot here, and then you see the line right there. That's a cool shape, and then it kind of fades out to where you can almost see the background right there in the center. Again, all of those shapes that I pointed out would work well for the middle of your story or the end of your story. And you need to kind of look at what you want to use for the beginning of your story. Sometimes you have to see through the layers because there's so much going on in this particular reference image. You have to pick out different layers to use for that purpose. I like this shape right here. Again, it's a very curved shape, very similar to what we use when we are creating an airbrushed rendering of fire. It's nice how it comes back up around the opposite direction here, and then even comes to a little bit of a point. You follow that line down, and then there's another somewhat traditional looking lick or negative space right there, and then you could follow that down along this line, or you could even follow it down along this line. That wider base makes for a good beginning to your story. Another one I like is this section here, and this is a little bit more of looking through some of these layers. Here's a really nice shape. That curve right there, which again is very similar to the shapes that we use on our freehand shields. But then if you look, it kind of curves back up and fades off into nothing, and then you've got this lick here in front of it. But you can see a line right there that kind of comes to a little bit of a tip that you could incorporate there, and then you could follow this line over, and it comes to this little tip where the hot spot is with the yellow, or you could even bring this into it, and then you could bring it down along this shape, or even bring it down along this shape. Again, that would make a good beginning to the story that we're trying to tell. Those are just a few of the elements that I really like in this particular reference image, elements that I think would translate really well into an artist interpretation of what fire might look like. The cool thing about this is there really aren't any rules. You as the artist can interject your own style and your own influence into your own paintings. You can completely personalize it if you wish to do so. There are other elements in this reference image that are usable as well. Pick out what you like. Use your imagination. Pick out what you think would be appealing to the viewer. As long as you're following the tips that we laid out in part 1, you're going to turn out a good product. Remember to have good structure. You've got to have a beginning, a middle, and an end to your story. Use some freehand strokes. Try to use your freehand shield sparingly, and try not to use the same shape over and over and over again. From here, I want to show you guys how I would go about rendering some of these shapes that we pointed out in paint. So let's talk about the materials and the products I'll be using throughout the rest of this video. I'll be using my Iwata HPCS airbrush. It's a 0.35 millimeter needle and nozzle set, mid-range airbrush. My air pressure is set at about 30 psi. I'm going to be using black paint and black paint only. It's Createx Illustration Black. I've reduced it 2:1, meaning 2 parts paint to 1 part 4011 reducer. I reduce my paint using little medicine cups so that I can get an accurate mix. And once you mix the paint, make sure you allow it to sit for about 10 to 15 minutes before you actually spray it. That gives the paint and the reducer time to really emulsify and become one product. It sprays much better if you allow it to sit for about 10 to 15 minutes. For stencils, I'm going to be using a set of Airsick stencils. This is the Arson set. I will leave links to all the products that I'm using in this video in the description below. Why only black? I want to keep it simple in the beginning. At this point, I just want to show you how I would go about creating some of these portions that we pointed out that I really like, the elements that I think would translate well into an airbrushed fire painting So I'm going to keep it simple from the beginning and just use one color. Part 3, we'll move on to using colors. So first, let's pick out an element that we want to paint, and we'll go from there. To start out, I really like this particular flame lick in the top right corner. So let's work on recreating that with paint. The very first thing I want to do is make sure that my airbrush is spraying correctly, that my reduction ratio is good for the air pressure that I'm using. I can do that by spraying on a scrap piece of paper or just on the back of my easel. So I'll do that now. That looks good. The airbrush is working correctly. The paint was starting and stopping where I wanted it to. The atomization looks good, so we can continue. First thing I want to do is work on recreating that shape, how it kind of curves. There's a couple ways you can do that. You can go in and spray just freehand strokes to kind of map it out, or you can use a freehand shield to assist you in that. I'll show you the method with the freehand shield first. So that very top uppermost portion curves back this way. So using a freehand shield, I'm going to lay the shield directly on the surface. I'm going to spray very lightly. The lines on this particular flame lick are pretty well defined in this area, as well as the curve underneath. So I may want to use a shield to catch that curve on the bottom side as well. Let me find a better shield for that particular curve. Something like that would work. Again, very lightly spraying color onto the surface. Now you'll notice I left this section plain. This is just dissipating. It's fading out into nothing. Same thing down here. So I can come in with a freehand stroke to finish this off. And then we can fog in some more color. Now this particular flame lick turns down pretty sharply. That's almost a 90-degree angle looking at the reference image. So you can do that with, again, a freehand stroke. For the other side, you could use a freehand shield or a freehand stroke. Maybe a little of both. Kind of have that hot spot right in this area in the actual reference image. So I may throw some freehand strokes in there, and again just fogging some more color within. And I'm using the inner more portion of this particular flame lick. The second layer actually makes this bottom section a little bit wider, and that's completely up to you as the artist. You can pick and choose what you want to do as far as that goes. For the little ember tip on the top, you can do that either freehand stroke or you can use a freehand shield. You could put a curved shield up here. I'm going to spray just on the bottom, kind of create that, and then I'll finish it off freehand. and then fog a little bit of color in there. You'll notice that this little section right here isn't technically connected. That's okay. You don't have to connect everything you do. Your eye will put that together. But that's a very simple way to kind of recreate that particular flame lick. And if you wanted to add the little flick you see in the photograph coming off of this section, you can do that very easily with a freehand stroke or two. And you'll notice there's a lot of different shades and values in this one little example using only one color. And that goes back to what I was talking about in part one as far as keeping some of your fire translucent or transparent so that you can see through to the underlying layers. If this was the second or even third layer of fire that we were creating, you would still be able to see some of the details behind this. That's what you want. It's okay to have some opaque areas in there. Like all these darker areas are going to be opaque. You're not necessarily going to see through that, but you want to keep some translucency in your fire as well. Now, just because you see a flame lick that you really like in your reference image, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to recreate that flame lick exactly as you see it in the reference. You have artistic license, you have an imagination, you can do whatever you want. This isn't exactly like the flame lick pictured in the reference. It's somewhat close, and that's all it takes. I'm not trying to recreate it exactly as I see it. This is more of a guide giving me an idea of what I want to do. You can change it as you see fit. For example, I don't necessarily like that little hot burning ember at the very tip of it. I would probably omit that. And if I wanted to change the shape some, I could do that as well. So I would probably rather do something with a little bit sharper tip. So beginning with the tip this time rather than one of the shapes using a freehand shield, and then you can come in and do the same thing. So I'll add a little bit of shading there with a freehand shield, and then I might continue with freehand. Freehand doesn't have to be a super sharp line. That was just fogging in a little bit of paint using just the airbrush, not a freehand shield. And then for the other end, I might come back in with a freehand shield. Fog in a little bit of paint there. Again, right now, this little section doesn't necessarily connect. It doesn't have to, but I think it would probably look a little bit better if I had a little bit more there. So you can see I just added or made this line a little bit, carry it a little bit further up. It still doesn't quite connect with this one, but I did carry it up a little bit farther, and then I just fogged in some paint inside. For the next section, I might add a little bit of a kick out there, some freehand, and a lot of times I like to just go in and freehand, just throw a couple lines in there, and that's kind of how I tend to build my fire. And then I can work around that. So if I wanted this to come back, say, to the right and then back down, I might just throw a line or two like that, and then I can use my freehand shields to kind of finish this off. We'll find a different shield. There again, that doesn't technically connect with paint, but it looks like it could connect. If that were a little bit of a hot spot there, you can fog in a little bit more color to make that a little bit brighter. So this particular flame lick doesn't really look anything like this one, and it doesn't really look like the flame lick in the reference image. Again, you don't have to paint it exactly as you see it. This is just an idea. I'm using the reference as an idea for what I want to create. So let's pick out another shape on the reference image to work on. Like this section right here, let's work on this lick, which is very similar to what we just did, but it's a little bit different. So we'll work on just this portion right here. So this one's very similar to what we just did in the fact that it comes up and then it's almost a 90-degree angle where that flame lick turns and goes off to the side. So same thing, I could use a freehand stroke to begin, giving myself that column going up. And that's just fogging a little bit of paint in, and then I can find a corresponding shape on a freehand shield, because that bottom edge is pretty defined, and lay it across, lightly fogging some paint in there. Now you can see there's a little bit of overspray that got into my column. I'm not concerned about that. That will get covered up later. If it doesn't get covered up in this particular layer, you can always use the next layer to hide little mistakes like that. This comes up to almost a point. It's got a really nice little curve and a point there at the tip. So using a freehand shield, I can create that and maybe a few little freehand strokes to brighten that area up. Brighten up this area on the bottom because it's quite a bit brighter on that bottom side looking at the reference image. Same thing with our column coming up here. We can brighten up a little bit of that, and that also hides our little mistake where I had the overspray in there. And then might as well go ahead and add that upper portion, which I can use just a freehand shield to create that circular shape there. And I'm lining this up close to the shape that we created with the freehand shield here. It doesn't have to be perfect. Overspray is kind of your friend when you're creating this kind of art. It's a little bit foggier on this top portion in the reference image compared to the lower portion. And this actually curves around and has another little hot spot. So we can fog that in, and then this upper portion of that flame, again, not as in focus, got a little bit more of a hot spot up there, and then it curves around before coming to that defined peak. but it would look something like that. Now, this isn't quite as appealing to the eye as I would like it to be. So again, I wouldn't try to paint this exactly as I see it in the reference image. And this is not exactly as it looks in the reference image. This is a little bit different because I'm not perfect. I'm not trying to copy it perfectly, but I would probably change this up to make it a little more appealing to the viewer's eyes. So I might come in and create this top portion first, followed by bringing in that tip. Get rid of some tip dry there. You can still add some freehand strokes in here. Those freehand lines that I talked about in part one. Fogging in some color. What I really don't like about this particular lick is that right kind of angle right there. That looks a little bit strange to me. So to change that, I would probably just use freehand shield to make that turn. And do something similar to that. Now, none of this on its own looks just like fire if you were looking at just what I've done. And this doesn't look all that great. It's not super detailed. It doesn't need to be. It's chaotic. We're trying to keep it very organic in nature. And remember what we talked about in part one as far as adding freehand strokes and not, again, making everything so opaque. Keep some translucency in there to where you can see through into the other layers that you've created before this. This is more of what I would be doing on the second and third layers of fire. My first layers are very loose and a little bit more opaque depending on what I'm working on and the colors I'm working with. But this is the basics. It's just putting different shapes together to create your flame licks. So let's pick another flame lick to play with. How about this section right in here, and probably bring it down right there. Again, you can start this using a freehand shield, or you can go in and do it freehand. This one kind of has the left edge curving in, out, and then it comes back in and then comes up to a point. So I would probably start this using a freehand shield to create that inner shape on this end. And you can put the little jog that it has in there, or you can omit that completely and make it just a nice round circle. That is a hot spot, so I would use a little bit of freehand and kind of fog that area in. And then it comes up and comes back around. So I would need to find another shield for that edge. Maybe this one. You see what I just did there? I had a freehand stroke coming up, and then I continued that with the use of the freehand shield. So incorporate both. Using a mix will really improve your results. It fades out a little bit towards the top here before it kind of comes to a little bit of a point. And then it comes back in just a little. Again, this is not exactly what it looks like in the reference image, but I'm not trying to create exactly what I see in the reference image. I'm kind of using it as a guide. And it comes back up very softly. Find a better shield for that. And that other side is very, very light. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to keep it very, very light when you're painting your fire. You can make this darker if you wish, or you can keep it lighter. Let the tip dry off the end of my needle. And then it's just fogging color in at the bottom. Create some hot spots in there, which I know this looks weird because we're using black, but the darker areas would be the hot spots. This is almost a negative of fire, what we're creating now. And I kind of like that little section right to the right that has some interesting movement in it. You could create that with just some freehand strokes. Fogging the top of it off too. Let's look at one more. I really like this particular shape. It's one that I use pretty frequently when I'm creating fire, and it's this one right here. I pointed this shape out earlier. I really like this curve and then how it comes back up right in here. So ignoring all of this other stuff, I like to incorporate that shape and then bring it down and change it up just a little bit. So I'll show you guys how I do that. So beginning with the freehand shield, remember to use different shapes, use different shields. This Arson Airsick stencil set that I'm using in this video has 6 different freehand shields, so you get a lot of variety. But I'll pick a shape that kind of resembles that curve we just looked at in the reference image, and I'm going to fog some color in there. Now in that little flame lick that I just showed you, this then comes right back up to the right. You can do that again, either freehand strokes, or you can find a freehand shield to help you with that. Personally, I'm going to use just a freehand stroke to bring it back up and around. Fogging in around it, and then again you can take your freehand shield and create the inside portion of this flame lick. Here's a cool trick too. If I have the freehand shield in this position, I'm leaving all of this open, which can fade out into nothing and almost look like it's connecting with the flame lick we have directly above it. So let's do that real quick, because that just works out cool. So I'm going to fog in some color towards the top. I'll get a little bit heavier at the bottom. So that right there looks like it's almost connecting to that flame, even though that's not what I was trying to do, even though they're not actually connected. You don't have to connect every single flame lick to each other. Leave some negative space in there. Let your mind wander and figure it out for itself. For the bottom of this, I like to keep a hot spot right there where it turns. Probably darken in that. I might add some freehand where we use the shield. Just because you use a freehand shield doesn't mean you can't freehand back over it. You can use the freehand shield to give you a rough idea of what you want to do, and then you can change and refine it from there. For this particular lick, I would probably fade it out on the left side, and depending on where it's starting or what's underneath it, that would kind of determine what I would do on the bottom side. On the flip side of that, if you wanted this to be more of a sharp point, you could do the same thing. So using the freehand shield like I just did a minute ago to create that first curve, some tip dry, and then I'll freehand. I apologize, one of my GoPro batteries died right there. But the basic premise that I was trying to get to here is if you want to sharpen up the tip of this particular flame lick, all you have to do is move your freehand shield in and sharpen it up with the freehand shield. So I'll demonstrate that real quick. So with the freehand shield, if I use it to close that gap off at the top, that will give us a very sharp edge. You want to be careful because you'll get overspray outside of the flame lick doing this when you have a tight area like that. So I just want to fog in a little bit of color at the tip, and then I'll make it a little more solid down at the bottom, and then you can come back in freehand if you want and finish sharpening that off. Fog a little bit of color in there. That's basically the same thing we just did here, although rather than opening this up and letting it travel upward, we closed that off. Let's do one more. This time I want to do something a little bit different. I want to do something very similar to this shape right here, which resembles very closely a traditional flame lick on a traditional hot rod style flame job. But I want to do something just a little bit different with it. So you can find a freehand shield that has something similar to that traditional, really nice curved hot rod style flame lick. I'm going to use this one right here. Rather than building the fire around it like I would traditionally do, which is creating the negative space using the freehand shield, and then normally we would come in and finish this out. However, we chose to do that. Sometimes rather than going through and finishing out that particular flame lick, I will use the same approach, but I'm only going to use the stencil to create that negative space, and then the bottom side can drift off and fade into nothing, dissipate into nothing. So it looks something like this. That creates a flame lick using only the stencil to create that negative space shape, but then it fades out and drifts down into almost nothing. And you could use that to connect other flame licks or other portions of your flame licks in a realistic fire paint job. That's the basics of how I use a reference image to pick out different little portions of any given photograph that I like, that I think would be easy or work well in a artist's interpretation of a painting of realistic fire. And then I try to recreate those little sections that I like. This doesn't look all that great, honestly. It doesn't. This is part of the reason, I think, is because we used one color, black, so it's more like a negative. But none of this is extremely sharp or detailed. There's overspray in areas outside the lines in some situations. That's okay. This doesn't have to be crisp and clean, super detailed. The overspray, again, works to your advantage when you're creating fire. It's something you have to practice. You have to play with it. Again, keep in mind that you want some translucent areas as well as some hot spots and even some opaque areas in some places. So now let's look at how I would take different elements that I like from a reference image and put those together to create one fire paint job. Taking all of those singular elements that we just created and then putting them together to create one piece of art, rendering realistic fire, is one thing that I've watched a lot of people struggle with. You have to have some creativity, you have to use your imagination. Most of all, this takes some practice. The more you practice this stuff, the better you will get at it. You'll learn how to structure your fire, how to make it flow. You'll learn what works and what doesn't. For this demonstration, what I did is I took all those singular elements that we just painted and I cut them out so that we can copy and paste things onto the canvas to give you an idea of what it might look like in the end when you actually paint it. So starting with this one, I think would make a good base for the fire. This is the beginning of our story. And then we can add elements using those singular elements that we've already created. And you can create as many of those as you want. You don't have to create the exact same ones I did. You can create the same ones I did and then add some more to it if you'd like. But then you can take and start experimenting with putting things up here to see what it might look like if you put all of this together. Might add that one up just a little bit. That's not bad. I don't necessarily like how we have 3 points coming at the same level, so we can move it around. And change it however you want to. I think this one would probably be the end of the story. We could have maybe something like that. Let me move this one down. Kick this behind that one. That's not bad. Might move these just a little bit more. Anyway, you get the idea. You can mix and match and paste these in pretty much any order that you want, and then try and create this as one image. So let's just try this and see what happens. Beginning with the start of our story, start to create some of this, and now I've got this one where it kind of connects with this one, so I may not keep how this comes back around. Maybe change the shape up in here just a little bit. Sometimes you have to turn your freehand shields in many different directions, looking for the shape that you really want. See, I don't really like that line there, but that's light enough that it shouldn't matter. We should be able to cover that up. Continuing to change the different stencils that I'm using, freehand shields. And it's always good to throw some embers in. Now, does this look exactly like what we've copied and pasted? No. Does it need to look exactly like what we've copied and pasted? Of course not. This is very similar to using a photographic reference in that it's a reference, it's a guide. It gave me an idea of what I wanted to create, but I'm in no way tied to making it look exactly like this. In fact, I think this looks a little bit better than this does. One thing I do notice is I have a lot of flame licks in this particular example that are very similar to traditional style hot rod flames. There's nothing wrong with that, it still works. I find myself doing that more often though when I'm not using an actual photographic reference, because that's what I think of subconsciously when I'm thinking about an artist's interpretation of what fire looks like. I've done so many of those traditional style hot rod flame jobs over the years that it's ingrained in my head, and I'll do it without thinking. I did this without even thinking about it until I look at it now. This was a brand new approach to teaching how to do this. I've never tried this approach before as far as using black, which actually turned out to be a little more difficult to paint this using only black than I thought it would be, and also breaking things down into singular elements and then copying and pasting it. So I came up with the idea and I decided to try it first in video format, which was kind of dumb on my part because I don't have anybody here to give me instant feedback on whether or not it helped them or not. So if you guys got something out of this, please let me know in the comments. If you see something or have an idea of how I could make it better to help you guys more, let me know that as well. Whether it's good or bad, I'll take all the feedback I can get. Remember to use your shields sparingly. Try not to use the same shapes over and over and over again, although I have kind of the same shapes over and over and over again in there. But this one little void, you can see I've got this little kick out point. I did that intentionally just to make it something different than the normal oval or circular shapes that you see. This is not refined, it's not clean, it's a little chaotic, it's more organic, and that's what you're looking for when you're rendering fire. Remember, use some lines within your fire, keep some transparent areas so that you can see other layers, and you can use some opaque areas as well. We will cover working in layers and colors in part 3. Once again, I will leave links in the description below to all of the products that I used in this video. They are affiliate links, so if you choose to make a purchase and you purchase something through one of those links, I do get a very small portion of that sale which goes to support the channel, and I greatly appreciate that very much. When it comes to the freehand shields that you use to create your realistic fire, there's a lot of them available out there. This is just one example, the Airsick Arson set. If you are going to purchase freehand shields for this purpose, I highly recommend that you order a good airbrush designed template. These last forever. They're very flexible, which is great because you can lift corners up if you don't want overspray traveling around them. You can make your own out of cardboard. They're not going to last as long, but that will work as well. The one thing that I would discourage using is a French curve. An artist French curve is a thick plastic. They don't bend, so they're a lot harder to use, especially if you're working on a curved surface like a motorcycle tank. Hope you guys got something out of this. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share. I'm Trevor with Wicked Art Studio. I'll see you guys next time.